interface is king, and the algorithms and rules for moving and aiming and the way the game gives us feedback when we quote unquote pull the trigger is actually very, very different than when we have a controller in our hands with joysticks and triggers and buttons than if we're using a mouse and keyboard. And when we're watching the simulation happen, it could feel identical. But in fact, there's some very different things at play to make it just feel correct when we're using these different inputs. And input is king. And you have to iterate it with the device in your hand. And you have to know the feeling that you have to arrive at. There were some early attempts that kind of started to pave the way for the controller side of the equation. The triggers were no-brainers. Like when we got triggers, that was great. That was advanced. Like that was automatic. We didn't have to worry about that too much. It was pretty easy. It's about the joysticks, and some of the early attempts like GoldenEye on the N64. And for a lot of video gamers, GoldenEye was the first FPS they'd ever played because they'd never played games on the PC before. And it was funny. Those of us in the PC space, like we weren't as impressed by it. It's an amazing achievement and a great game, and I played it a lot. But you could feel that first kind of 1.0 attempt, but that you can tell they iterated towards how to use that single stick on that N64 controller. They iterated towards that feeling. They must have iterated towards it in the same way that we all did with the mouse and keyboard back, when those of us were around when the first-person genre was being invented. We had to figure it all out, and you could feel that the guys at Rare and however Nintendo was involved, they'd figured out a new kind of language, and that then was iterated upon with Halo, which was the first FPS that launched the Xbox. And I think Halo was the key turning point that allowed the FPS to be at home on a console. And those Bungie guys performed a miracle. And they not only figured out how to deal with all of the physics from a joystick point of view, but they added some new concepts, some new algorithms for auto-aiming and other bits of gravity, so that the crosshairs would tend to lean towards the target that the player was likely going for, even if they weren't perfectly precise with their own interface. And that there's a little help there that's subtle enough where the player doesn't realize he's being helped, but is sufficient where it's actually overcoming some of the weakness of the joystick when compared to the precision of a mouse. And that was a really great invention, and Bungie offered the whole industry a gift there when they figured that out. And I know that I worked on Halo for the PC, the original, and when interacting with those guys, that was a very complicated, well, I don't want to say complicated, it was a very iterative process using focus tests, like getting people off the street of different types and backgrounds, putting a joystick in their hand and just watching what happens, parsing the data that comes from the joystick. I mean, they had a PhD in psychology driving that unit there in the test lab, and they figured it out. And some of us, when I say us, I'm talking about the industry, reverse engineered from Halo. Others, because we'd done it before on the PC side, we were actually kind of excited to figure it out all over again as we started making FPSs on the consoles.